You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fellow, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning.
The joke was only about the plumber, but the part about waiting years for a car, that was no exaggeration. In the Soviet Union, even if you had the money and the will, getting a car was almost impossible. In this film, I'll explain why that happened, how people found semi-legal ways to get around the system, and how this shortage became one of the quiet signals of the Soviet collapse. Let's start with a brief look at the early Soviet years, a time when owning a car in Russia was still something extraordinary. In the 1920s, domestic production was almost non-existent. Most vehicles on Soviet roads were nationalized foreign cars, many taken from the former imperial garage, and used mainly for official purposes. One of the first private car owners in the young Soviet Union was the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. In 1928, with special permission from the Commissariat of Foreign and Domestic Trade, he brought a Renault NN from France as a gift for Lilia Brick. He didn't drive himself, but for her, it was a symbol: freedom, independence, movement. Soon other famous names followed: opera singer Antonina Nezhdanova with a Ford Model A, actress Lyubov Orlova with a Packard 120. But these were exceptions, people of status and privilege. For an ordinary Soviet citizen, a private car was almost a myth. Yet, paradoxically, most men could drive, or at least were taught to. The state organized mass driver training programs, believing driving skills might one day serve in defense of the country. And so, the automobile entered Soviet life not as a luxury, but as a matter of national purpose. By the 1930s, the Soviet automobile industry was finally beginning to take shape. But the country's main priority wasn't personal cars. It was trucks, tractors, and buses, the machines needed to build, farm, and defend. Passenger cars were far down the list. Yet it was during this decade that the city of Gorky began assembling the first Soviet-made passenger car, the GAZ-A. It was a licensed copy of the Ford Model A, with equipment and blueprints purchased from Ford Motor Company in 1929. Technically, private citizens could buy one, but very few could afford it. The price was 8,000 to 9,000 rubles, while the average monthly salary was only 150 to 200. For the same money, you could build a small house or buy several cows. So the GAZ-A was far from a people's car. It became a vehicle of status, used by the police, postal service, military, and the NKVD. There were attempts to make something truly affordable, like the Kim 10, a compact car designed in the late 1930s. But history intervened. World War II began, and the entire industry was redirected toward defense. By the early 1950s, trucks and utility vehicles were still the state's top priority, yet passenger car production finally stabilized. This era saw the arrival of the Moskvich 401, a near copy of the pre-war Opel Kadett, and the GAZ M20 Pobeda, often, though incorrectly, called a copy of the Opel Kapitan. In theory, even the large GAZ 12 Zim could be purchased privately, but in practice, only with personal permission from the Council of Ministers or top-level ministries. Such cars were reserved for prominent figures: artists, scientists, athletes, generals, and enterprise directors. Yet demand for Pobedas, and especially for Moskviches, far exceeded expectations. Buying a car required two things: saving enough money and being allowed to join the waiting list. Priority went to workers in science, technology, culture, and medicine, professions considered essential for the country's progress. Next came industrial heroes, war veterans, and citizens with special merits. With an average engineer's salary of about 800 rubles, the Moskvich 401 cost around 8,000, and the Pobeda roughly 16,000 rubles. The wait was about 4 years, but for many, the goal still seemed achievable. By the early 1960s, things had begun to change. People's savings were growing. More citizens could afford a car. Yet Soviet factories could cover barely 20% of the real demand. The queues grew longer, on average 6 to 7 years of waiting. It wasn't that the government was unaware. On the contrary, officials clearly saw that citizens had saved up money, but had little to spend it on. These idle savings dropped out of circulation, and before long, that started to irritate the country's leadership. The automobile became a convenient solution. Buying a car returned that money to the state economy, and it didn't make people angry. In essence, the car turned into a perfect mechanism for pulling excess cash from the population, one where everyone seemed satisfied. People got what they wanted, and the state got the money moving again. In the 1960s and 70s, the phrase "people's car" became deeply rooted in Soviet culture. Year after year, officials promised that soon the country's roads would be filled with affordable, simple, and reliable cars for everyone. The closest thing to that dream was the Zaporozhets, small, noisy, but by far the cheapest car in the USSR. Getting on the waiting list for one was easier than for other models, and for many families, it became their first real chance to own a car. Meanwhile, other factories kept expanding their production. But it soon became obvious. Demand was growing exponentially, while every plant in the country was already working at full capacity. The government made a strategic decision to buy a foreign license and an entire production line to rapidly increase car output and finally solve the shortage problem. This led to the creation of Lada, the huge factory built in Tolyatti with the help of Fiat. It was here that Lada cars were born, soon to become the symbol of Soviet mass motorization. The new plant did multiply production several times over, but even that wasn't enough. Demand continued to outpace supply, and the waiting lists eventually stretched to an incredible 10 years. At first glance, the solution seemed obvious. If domestic factories couldn't keep up, why not import cars from abroad? At the very least, from Allied socialist countries or perhaps from neutral capitalist ones. But as simple as that idea sounded, in practice, things were far more complicated. The socialist bloc countries simply didn't produce enough cars. Most of them struggled to meet even their own demand. Large-scale exports to the USSR were out of the question. A limited number of Polish, Czechoslovak, and East German cars did reach the Soviet Union, but those small shipments hardly made a dent in the shortage. So the next question naturally arose. Why not turn to nations that built plenty of cars and remained relatively neutral? Countries like Sweden or Italy could have easily supplied the USSR with Volvos and Fiats. But the obstacle wasn't technical. It was ideological. For the Soviet leadership, importing cars from the capitalist world meant admitting weakness. Buying from the West would have been a public confession that socialist industry couldn't keep up. At the time, the USSR was obsessed with the idea of economic self-sufficiency. The slogans of the 1950s were clear. We must produce everything ourselves, from a pin to an airplane. Even when the Soviet Union purchased licenses, like for the ZAZ or later for the Lada, it was always presented as technological cooperation, never as dependence on the West. In addition, any import required hard currency, dollars, pounds, or marks. The USSR earned them in limited quantities through exports of oil, timber, gold, and, interestingly in this context, through the export of automobiles. Indeed, roughly half of all Soviet-made cars were sold abroad, bringing in the foreign currency the state so desperately needed. In that light, importing foreign cars would have been, at the very least, illogical. Selling your own cars for hard currency and then spending that same currency to buy imported ones simply made no sense. The USSR reserved its hard currency for purchasing technology, equipment, and grain, especially during years of poor harvests. It's also important to understand the logic and context of that era. The USSR had a planned economy, and Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, was its central brain. It didn't just decide how many cars each plant should build. It determined in advance how many cars the country should have, who would get them, and at what price. The guiding principle was simple. The economy must be controlled, not driven by the whims of the market. Planning flowed strictly from the top down. Gosplan created the 5-year plan. The Ministry of the Automotive Industry distributed the quotas. The factories received control figures, not recommendations, but direct orders. How many cars, of which models, in which colors, and who they were for. In other words, the system was based not on demand, but on predetermined norms. In a planned economy, demand simply didn't matter. Gosplan's logic was, if last year there were 1 million passenger cars in the country, next year there will be 1.1 million, 10% more. That's enough. If the real demand was higher, it was ignored. The goal wasn't to sell, it was to fulfill the production plan. For the manufacturer, it made no difference whether people actually needed the cars. That destroyed any feedback between production and reality. The waiting list wasn't seen as a failure. It was seen as proof of success. People want it, so we're producing the right thing. And that was the core problem. The plan system simply couldn't recognize shortage as a flaw. But passenger cars weren't just private transport. They were also taxis, service vehicles, and government cars for all kinds of institutions. Gosplan also controlled how these vehicles were distributed. After meeting production quotas and allocating export shares, only about 10 to 15% of all cars actually reached retail sale, the waiting lists. So, was Gosplan really that short-sighted? Did they simply not see the problem? It's hard to say. What's clear is that even when they did realize the shortage, changing the plan was nearly impossible. Every adjustment required approval from dozens of agencies. By the time decisions were made, years had already passed. The ideological side of the story is just as important. In the Soviet worldview, a car wasn't a market product. It was a social good that the state distributed fairly among the deserving. The waiting list wasn't seen as a failure of the system. It was a mechanism of fairness. Not everyone could get a car at once, but everyone would get one according to merit. Of course, that kind of fairness raised many questions. The most common complaint was about favoritism. Party and industrial leaders, regional secretaries, factory directors, department heads, had the power to move names up the list or add the right people. Complaining was useless and even dangerous. It could easily push you further down the queue. There was also what might be called legal unfairness. Heroes of socialist labor, model workers, and communist activists often received cars out of turn, officially as rewards for their achievements. Add to that the regional imbalance. Moscow, Kyiv, and Minsk received far more cars than the provinces. On paper, everything looked just and organized, but in reality, fairness was an illusion. Over the years of waiting, people developed certain schemes, both legal and semi-legal, to move up the line faster. For example, a person could start working exceptionally hard, over-fulfilling production targets, and eventually earn the title of udarnik, a model worker, which allowed them to move significantly higher in the queue, or even to its front. This really worked. Supervisors treated such workers favorably and helped them whenever possible. But earning that title wasn't easy. It required working almost to exhaustion. Semi-legal schemes also existed. The most common was having the right connections, people who, for a reward, could move someone higher up the list. There were also so-called resellers. They constantly hung around car lots where citizens picked up their new vehicles, offering to buy them on the spot. And the offers were no joke. The buyout could be twice the official price. paid immediately as the car left the lot. These resellers then offered the same cars to others in line, adding their own markup. So, what can we say in the end? In those conditions, the problem simply had no solution, at least not within the system that existed. The people who could have solved it didn't even see it as a problem, and to truly fix it would have meant changing the entire structure of the state and the economy, something no one was willing to do. Many believe that the lack of real mass motorization played a part in the collapse of the Soviet Union. The country fell behind technologically because there was no motivation to change anything, whether it was cars, tape recorders, or refrigerators. As long as demand was high and shortages were the norm, everything sold anyway. Why improve a product if people buy it regardless? But with each passing year, progress kept slipping further away. Technology aged, and by the late 1980s, Soviet cars, like much of Soviet industry, were simply no longer competitive. The car industry was connected to dozens of others: engineers, designers, suppliers. When it slowed down, the whole system slowed with it. There was also a moral side to it. People were frustrated that, even with money, they couldn't buy what they wanted. It clashed with all those speeches on TV about prosperity and the happiness of the working class. My father, who served as an officer in the Soviet Army during the 1980s, called such a situation humiliating. He wasn't anti-Soviet. He did his job honestly, and at 24, received a 2-room apartment. Of course, he was also on the waiting list for a car. His artillery school got only 5 vehicles a year, and his name was somewhere around number 180. But not everyone in the USSR dreamed of owning a car. My grandfather, for example, never stood in line for one. He said there was no need. In good weather, he walked to work, and when it rained, he took the tram with his coworkers. They chatted, joked, and enjoyed the ride. A car, he said, was nothing but worry, maintenance, hard to find spare parts, and the fear of theft. And he wasn't alone. There were plenty of cases where model workers were rewarded with the right to buy a car out of turn. They agreed, of course. Who would refuse? But then left the car sitting in a garage, never once using it. Even today, such time capsules still appear. Cars that sat untouched for 40 years and were never even registered. So as you can see, the issue of car shortages in the USSR is far more complex than it might seem at first glance. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories like this ahead.